In the winter of 1942, in Eastern Europe, an entire military formation disappeared behind a shrinking ring of fire and snow. The siege began quietly, with no clear front line and no clear end in sight. Orders were given. Positions were held. Supplies ran out. When the silence finally came, no one was left to describe it.By early 1942, Eastern Europe had become a landscape defined by exhaustion. The initial momentum of the German advance had slowed, and the front lines no longer moved with speed or certainty. Towns changed hands without ceremony. Villages emptied. Roads disappeared under snow and mud. In this environment, entire units could vanish without immediate notice. The formation at the center of this story was not considered elite. It was assembled from multiple depleted regiments and reassigned to hold a strategic corridor near a small, unnamed settlement. Maps marked it as important. The soldiers on the ground saw only broken houses, frozen fields, and a forest that swallowed sound. Their mission was defensive. Hold the line. Secure the supply route. Prevent encirclement. These objectives were delivered through written orders and brief radio transmissions. The assumption was that the front was stable enough to support static positions. That assumption would prove fatal. The siege did not begin with an attack. It began with absence. Recon patrols failed to return. Liaison units reported delays. Supply convoys arrived late, then not at all. At first, this was attributed to weather. Snowstorms were common. Roads were unreliable. No one panicked. The soldiers dug in. Trenches were reinforced with timber taken from abandoned homes. Ammunition was counted carefully. Food was rationed earlier than expected. Communication lines remained open, but messages became shorter and less frequent. Requests for clarification went unanswered. What the men could not see was the gradual closing of enemy movements around them. The opposing forces did not rush. They advanced cautiously, cutting paths, occupying high ground, severing roads. The goal was not immediate destruction, but isolation. By late January, the perimeter had narrowed. Patrols reported movement in the woods at night. Flares revealed nothing but trees and snow. Gunfire was rare, but its echo carried too far, too clearly. It suggested proximity. Command still believed relief was possible. Plans were discussed. Timelines were adjusted. The word temporary appeared repeatedly in reports. Temporary shortages. Temporary delays. Temporary isolation. But isolation is rarely temporary in winter warfare. The civilian population had already fled or been removed. There were no guides. No informants. No shelters beyond what the soldiers built themselves. The land offered no warning before it turned hostile. By the time higher command acknowledged the risk of encirclement, the situation on the ground had already shifted beyond recovery. The siege had not been announced. It had simply begun. Quietly. Methodically. Without witnesses. As February progressed, the situation tightened. The perimeter contracted by meters, not kilometers. Each lost observation post reduced visibility. Each abandoned trench narrowed the remaining space. The soldiers became aware of the siege not through orders, but through routine. Ammunition shortages forced restraint. Fire was returned only when necessary. Artillery support was requested repeatedly but never arrived. The guns that were meant to protect the position had been reassigned or destroyed elsewhere. What remained were rifles, machine guns, and cold hands. Radio communication deteriorated. Static replaced voices. Batteries failed in the cold. Messages that did get through were outdated by the time they were received. Orders contradicted observations. Maps no longer matched reality. Inside the perimeter, discipline held, but tension grew. Sleep was fragmented. Frostbite cases increased. Wounded men could not be evacuated. Field medical supplies were insufficient. Every injury carried long-term consequences. Attempts were made to break out. Small units probed weak points in the encirclement. None succeeded. Those who left the perimeter did not return. No bodies were recovered. No reports followed. The opposing force applied pressure selectively. Night harassment disrupted rest. Snipers targeted exposed positions. Mortar fire struck supply caches rather than troop concentrations. The goal was attrition without engagement. Food became the central concern. Rations were reduced again. Horses were slaughtered. Bread froze solid. Hunger altered judgment. Men argued over assignments that once seemed routine. Leadership focused on maintaining order rather than advancing plans. Morale declined without collapse. There were no mass refusals. No open defiance. Only resignation. The understanding that time was no longer an ally. Command finally authorized a full withdrawal attempt. The order arrived late and without support. There would be no diversionary attacks. No coordinated movement. Each unit was to act independently when conditions allowed. Conditions never allowed. Snowfall intensified. Visibility dropped to near zero. Movement became impossible during daylight. At night, the forest concealed both escape and death. The siege was no longer defined by enemy presence, but by environmental dominance. Cold immobilized weapons. Hunger slowed reaction. Silence replaced communication. By the end of the month, resistance had become fragmented. Positions were abandoned without notice. Fires were extinguished to avoid detection. The perimeter dissolved inward. What remained was not a line, but a cluster of isolated pockets. Each unaware of the others. Each waiting for something that would not come. The final phase did not resemble battle. There was no decisive assault. No breakthrough. No moment of visible collapse. It began with stillness. Enemy fire ceased almost entirely. Observation revealed no movement. For hours, then days, the surrounding positions remained silent. This was not retreat. It was containment completed. Inside the remaining pockets, men waited. Some expected an attack. Others expected relief. Neither arrived. One by one, positions fell silent. Radio operators transmitted until power failed. The last messages were incomplete. Coordinates without context. Single words repeated. Medical stations were overrun by cold and infection. Wounded men could not be moved. Morphine ran out. Bandages were reused. Eventually, there was nothing left to do. A final breakout attempt was made by one of the largest remaining groups. They moved before dawn. The snow concealed them briefly. Machine gun fire ended the attempt within minutes. Survivors scattered into the forest. None regrouped. What followed was erasure. Enemy forces advanced cautiously, occupying empty trenches. They encountered abandoned equipment. Frozen bodies. Weapons still loaded. No organized resistance remained. The siege ended without a surrender. No documents were signed. No prisoners were counted. There was no formal conclusion. Records later listed the formation as lost. Not destroyed. Not captured. Lost. The area was reoccupied, then abandoned again as the front shifted. Graves were unmarked. Personal effects were scattered or buried. Identification was impossible. By the time the war moved on, there was nothing left to investigate. No witnesses. No surviving officers. No civilians who remembered names. The silence was complete. The siege ended without a signal. No final order was issued. No announcement followed. One day, transmission stopped. Radio operators waited for replies that never came. Then even the static faded. Headquarters marked the area as neutralized. Maps were revised. Lines were redrawn. The unit designation was removed from future plans. No recovery teams were sent. The front had moved. Resources were needed elsewhere. What remained was considered unreachable. The men inside the perimeter were not counted as prisoners. They were not confirmed dead. They existed only as numbers without resolution. Winter sealed the ground quickly. Snow-filled trenches. Collapsed shelters disappeared beneath ice. Weapons froze where they had been dropped. The forest absorbed everything. Paths vanished first. Then markers. Then memory. When the area was briefly revisited months later, there was little to find. No organized positions. No intact records. Only fragments. A helmet frozen into the earth. A rifle without a sling. Paper turned to pulp by moisture and time. No names could be matched. No ranks identified. No clear boundary of where the siege had ended. Reports described the site as abandoned. They used neutral language. Cleared. Inactive. Secure. The word siege was no longer applied. After the war, investigators focused on larger catastrophes. Encirclements with survivors. Battles with clear timelines. Defeats with documented conclusions. This place did not qualify. There were no witnesses to interview. No commanders to question. No civilians who remained. Archives mention the formation briefly. A footnote. A line without explanation. Later revisions removed even that. The men were never officially declared fallen together. Their deaths were assumed individually. Quietly distributed across paperwork. Families received no unified notice. Some received none at all. The land was repurposed. Fields were plowed. Trees were cut and regrown. Roads shifted. Nothing indicated what had happened there. Years passed without reference. Then decades. History advanced through documented events. This was not one of them. No monument stands on the site. No date is observed. No silence is officially kept. Only the absence remains. Not dramatic. Not symbolic. Just empty ground. And a gap where voices should have been. The siege did not end with defeat. It ended with disappearance. And in the records that followed, that silence was enough. Thank you for watching. New historical stories are published regularly.